I'm Michael Burrows, and I'm Assistant Director of the Rock Ethics Institute here at Penn State University. And I'm here today with Dr. Charles Burford, Director of Educational Leadership at Australian Catholic University. So thanks very much for joining us here today, Charles.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you.
To start, I wanted to ask you a bit about some of your current research. And if you could just tell us a bit about some of the things that you're focusing on most currently in your research and that's interesting you most now.
Yeah. At the moment now, the research is focusing on the curriculum areas around moral literacy and how moral literacy is being basically informed within educational processes at different levels. That particular interest is an ongoing thing for me, and it's emerged from a research project that I did with one of my doctoral people about 4 years ago. And in that research, we actually looked at the impact of student results in nationally normed tests being used by governments to attempt to raise levels and outcomes. It's a fairly international movement that's in school systems, and what this actually caused amongst teachers, administrators, and the principals in particular in the schools. And we did this research, as I said, this is basically 2010. And it became apparent as we were doing the research, and we were really looking at it more from a pedagogical and a school change process in terms of school improvement, that there was some hidden things going on rather than just school improvement. And all of the staff of Fordham and others and Hardgraves and people who look at school improvement have pointed towards things like moral purpose and the tensions that occur at the moral and the ethical level for people in school improvement projects. But this kind of particular school improvement processes which were being instigated by a public, by the governments, using as the stimulus the results from students in these nationally normed tests, were producing clear tensions in people at various levels that weren't just tensions about the nature of actually how you use data, but was really tensions about the nature of what it was doing to their roles as teachers, as leaders, and as principals, and causing them to raise questions about the purpose of education for them. That caused me to start to kind of try and see if I could put it together in some particular way from a research perspective. And so I tried to concentrate on what I call the public domain, which was seen to be pressing in on the moral purpose domain and its consequences for the professional domain. And I saw the three of them as causing tensions for individuals. And this was well received by administrators, because they thought it did actually answer many of the questions that they felt were going on about the tensions in their own roles as leaders. And I felt that it was actually quite good, but I didn't really, I think it fully explained the nature of what was behind these moral tensions. And I thought they were moral tensions. And so with further research that I was doing, and that actually was a follow-up research in 2012, I consulted and researched with academics, and they include Jerry Starrett, Stephen Gross, Nancy Tawana, Paul Begley, and others who worked in this area, and I asked them about the nature of where this model, and it was called a model of tension and decision making. Discernment, yes, but discernment about the nature of the tensions. And their feedback actually pointed me towards where I think I am now, and that is the development of a taxonomy that attempts to explain how the identification of the nature of the moral issues, and in that case the moral tensions, can actually be experienced in a way that can be explained from that taxonological kind of position, which simply kind of says, well, that there are different types of tensions caused by different kinds of purposes. And I've used purposes because the purposes basically seem the best way to explain what's going on at that particular stage. I call them dimensions, and at the moment now, what I'm trying to test through is not only how this influences the nature of educational leadership, which is my specialist area, and I suppose the area of my prime research, but how it actually moves across into the broader areas of moral literacy, which has been the feature of this conference and this colloquium. To see if there is a way that we could explain and better understand the nature of how the tensions at various dimensions have consequences for decision making, and also for the discernment and for the actions at other levels. So, and this is now, and it's being, I suppose, backed up by my own experience with other researchers, for example. And I made in the paper that I presented on Friday night, I was talking about the research at University of Verona, where they actually have investigated the virtues process of children at Year 4 and Year 5. And when I was looking and working with them, it became apparent to me that they were fitting into this emerging taxonomy that I was trying to explain. Now, the taxonomy itself, if that seemed like a good time to talk about it, Michael,
Yes.
looks something like this now. It's while it does appear to be a concentric kind of a model in a taxonomy, it's not developmental in terms of it, and it's not basically in any way hierarchical. In fact, I think that I can see how the tensions basically flow forward and back, and have varying levels of impact at the different levels of the dimension. But not only that actually the consequences of the discernment and the tension and the action at each of the levels can be influenced differently across it. At the middle, I see two areas, and I call these the interior dimensions of the taxonomy. And they're well researched, and I think they've been part of our literature, our classic literature, on moral purpose. And I see moral purpose at the heart of this. And now, because, I firmly believe that at that moral purpose level, we're not only talking about the general issues of the universal, the search for universal values, which isn't clear, but is complex, and clear, and still the work of researchers today to identify, what do we have at that core level, but also to identify how we grow issues of what I call virtues, and that's those generic values that people basically seem to think are worthwhile of pursuing at various levels in our own life, and seeing them as being either one of national kind of processes or individual, localized, but virtues about the nature of values. So the whole model really addresses values, which I think is obvious. And so the morality of this issue is really picked up by the nature of what goes on in both virtues and with ethics. And I'll talk about how the ethical issue reflects itself. But at that moral purpose area, you will have a concentration on the nature of virtues, and very much from the Aristotelian kind of concept. In addition, we will actually exercise ethical conflict and ethical decision making within these dimensions. And so in that case there, we are forced to make ethical decisions about conflicting values, or values in some cases can be equally good, but need in some cases for us to make a decision about how we wish to go. And I've been trying to make the point, I suppose, that where the taxonomy helps, it simply says, well, that can actually be because of a particular purpose that I think morally about the nature of what I'm doing, if I'm working with kids or I'm working with adults or wherever it may be. The second of the interior dimensions is this issue of what I call personal purpose. And this is where we come into the whole area. You and I have been talking about the nature of the social psychological, but the work of people like Goldman and others, but also the work of Chris Branson and others who have simply said, that the self-awareness, the capacity to be able to recognise, to understand the nature of where we are in terms of our self-image, that those things that basically are influencing us. And so exercises in finding about the particular virtues which are important to us, and can I basically can I identify those processes, and can I actually see where the tensions are? And so that centre level, and a lot of the stuff that I saw in the primary schools, and where people are attempting to get the kids to really kind of identify what it is in themselves. I would call that the interior. That's because it's the personal purpose. And because what I was also saying on Friday night was that this thing is not developmental in terms of age. I believe that the taxonomy, and of course it's true of all taxonomies, but if it's going to work, and it should work for everybody, and I see the issue of these dimensions, particularly this interior one, although not just particularly the interior one, but all the interior ones, as having consequences for adults as much as for children. And in that research that I was watching you conduct today, where you're attempting using early childhood, young literacy, to get them to identify their own preferred or their identification of virtues, and why they think these virtues were important in terms of the nature of the story line. I see the same kind of thing going on with doctoral students and master's degree students who grapple internally about the nature of why do you want to lead? Do you think you should lead? Where are the strengths and weaknesses in yourself, and how, what do you need to kind of address, because those internal things will have some, and how do you see these tensions emerging internally, both at the moral purpose level and at the personal purpose level, and in terms of an action model, I sometimes I despair a little bit, because I see people grapple with that and come up with the answers that they're not really in a position personally to handle the tensions in themselves, because they haven't never done that, and in fact they've just gone out and pursued stuff for the if you want, for the benefit of the exercise itself, rather than thinking what the consequences are. The second dimension of and I call that the interior. The interior dimension that has those two features. The second dimension is basically what I say is the nature of the role that we actually carry on. We carry through. Well, it's role and it's organisation, and that area there. As I said, it's too particular. The first one I call role. We started off as a result of the professional research I was doing with principals. We call it the professional, and I've still left that in the taxonomy, but I'm now calling it the role, because it professional doesn't necessarily work with everybody, but role simply is that we carry out some kind of things, and that function in life with role theory in terms of Bandura and that kind of research there, which I think it fits nicely into how the role will challenge us ethically and morally with what we do. And then the external one of that middle dimension is the organisation itself. And what I say in that is that organisations in themselves have a particular moral process and moral purpose, and like schools, which are quite different to banks. And why that gets me into trouble, I keep on saying to people, you've got to be very careful about mixing up organisations that have different moral processes and different moral orientations and purpose, like banks for profit and schools for growth. And so understanding the nature of those processes you can therefore understand the nature of the tensions. For example, in schools, when we get the pressure from the outside dimensions coming in to influence it, schools react on the basis of the best interest of kids. You know, banks react on the best interest of shareholders.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just because of the morality of both organisations in terms of how they actually see tensions are quite different. And that's where I hope that kind of model would fit. So, and the outer layer is what I call environment. And the outer layer has two dimensions as well. And the first dimension basically is the dimension of the dimension of the politic, or I call it public, but maybe it is politic. But it's those things which we are held accountable for and actually kind of institute responsibility in an organisation. It's usually government that's there, that impacts upon us, because the rationale, the morality of the issue is we do owe to that group. It's a public responsibility in most places. Or if it's law, it's still the government which basically constitutes these, and they do it for moral reasons. You know, if it's a constitution or whatever it might be, and therefore the processing within there is important, because it will impact upon the nature of those lower orders. And I said lower orders, I want to correct that. They're not lower orders, they're just different dimensions. But to give you the example, with No Child Left Behind, which is the educational innovation and kind of for the improvement of education, which has had many kind of side effects in American education, impacting on people, not only at the level of actually changing people's attitude towards curriculum, evaluation, pedagogy, reporting, but it's also impacted on a lot of people's lives, how they feel about themselves, not only as professionals, but right in to do I still want to do this? And then even into the level of actually people responding to this by cheating. Now, if you can see that kind of process of the pressure coming in from the external dimension of the environment, from the politic, coming straight into a principal or to a teacher, forcing them to teach or to assess or to even to report in a way which conflicts with their moral processes, which then actually comes in with a person sitting around simply saying, do I still want to do this? Or what's this doing to me? The outer layer of that environmental level, environmental dimension, is actually culture, and that culture can affect so much about the nature of how we see it. I was telling the story about having taught administrators and leaders in China and in Hong Kong in particular for a long time, until suddenly I was asking him a question one time and getting an assignment done, and they were working particularly well on all the stuff that I was teaching, which would be the stuff that you'd do here in leadership programs. So I suddenly realised that they were actually talking about Confucius, and they were talking about philosophical perspectives from an Asian perspective. Right. And so I asked them what that basically meant, and they said, well, we wouldn't do anything with the kind of things that you're talking about, because we respect seniority, and we respect tradition, and tradition is held within families, and so therefore we like the democratic processes of actually choosing the person best suited to carry out the role isn't necessarily the characteristic we'd go through. And here I was sitting here kind of teaching all this stuff, and so I thought to myself, the culture actually kind of dictates a whole lot of things. And in the same way, I've become aware, and I've been talking about that at the conference, about, say, the culture. Sometimes they even look like similar cultures, like Australia and America. Yet the fact that your constitution is different to ours has impacted very much in terms of, as far as the taxonomy goes, all the way through it. I don't know how much it does at the interior level, but I think it probably does. But at the exterior level, I've become aware of the fact that, if you take something like, and I don't want to use one example because, but I'll take the example and say in terms of gun control. that your constitution basically says that this is actually morally correct, which then kind of says, well, I understand that, but our constitution says it's not. Well, it's not our constitution. It's our people have basically kind of shown through referendum and that they don't want it, and therefore it's illegal, it's immoral to do it, which therefore means that the government basically can constitute laws and regulations which simply say it's just not possible. It should never happen. It is criminal for any weapon to be around a school. Well, you then come to your principal's jobs, and your principal's jobs are quite different, Michael, because I haven't got to worry about the ethical dimension of common good opposed to individual rights. I still worry about it. Every principal, every leader will consider that ethical tension. They're both good, common good and individual rights. But the tension between the two of them is quite different in America than Australia, because I consider the American principal is actually concerned very directly about the welfare of his school, because he can't be too certain about the nature of what's coming through the front door.
Right.
And you have the historical national story of the kind of massacres and the outrages which have occurred with kids. And so your concern really for the welfare of your kids is quite different here. I think we're very concerned about the welfare of our kids, but it's not something which actually causes us a great deal of moral concern or ethical dilemma, because we're shielded by the outer actions, the outer morality of the taxonomy, if that makes any sense. Yeah. What I suppose I've tried to suggest with the taxonomy is that it's an explanatory model. It attempts to define, as you know, and attempts to explain how the discernment of these particular dimensions can help us basically understand what is going on and where the contest is. So to give an example, if I could continue that example, and I hope that people who actually use this research don't worry too much about the example. But if you went to the issue of, say, checking children for weapons, the strip searching issue that Jackie Stepovich is so interested in and researching, it could be that we in Australia would look at that with some level of outrage. And we'd look at it that way because we have a preoccupation with the United Nations rights of the child.
Right.
But in point of fact, we may be judging it because we're judging it from that outer dimension that we have. We're judging it inappropriately, because the outer dimension in the American society, basically, which allows the moral pressure to come into the school about what is right and wrong in terms of what people have, causes the American principle to actually maybe sanction body searches. Now, you might say, well, that's denying the individual rights of the child, well, yeah, but look at the tension between the two ethics there and what causes it. And in point of fact, they're acting quite ethically and with a very sound moral core. So I would hope that maybe the taxonomy might give us a better view of action, and while not in some cases maybe kind of suggesting how the actions in themselves may vary in terms of purpose, if it gives us a better understanding, I think it can also help issues in terms of education. In terms of the education issue, as I was talking Friday night about how the taxonomy might help us think about curriculum, the very thing that you're researching and you're working on now, in terms of how do we teach for this stuff at the various levels, and that's where my research is at the moment now, and that's where I want to go on with. I want to go on to try and see how could we and how do we best grow that awareness and those insights about the nature of how we teach for that area.
Gotcha. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between moral literacy and moral purpose as you're using the term?
Yeah. As you know, I put the moral purpose right in that centre of it, because it seems to me to go back right to that moral the moral drive in life in people, the rightness, which is tied up to me in terms of virtues, like that honesty and honesty, care, those kind of things that we would say would be core to any kind of sophisticated, any democratic society, that we would hold those values as to be self-evident, that they are part of our life. That those things, and I think we all write about them and we all can simply take them for granted, but I think we mix up what it's about. But if I could put it this way, when I speak to teachers about the nature of why they teach, I find some that are driven by a moral purpose, and that is to make a difference in the life of children for a better world. Yeah. I find others that really think it's a really good job because you actually kind of have flexible hours. Right. Now, my point being is I think one really is driven by moral purpose and has addressed it that way. I'm not passing judgment on the contractual type of response. I think the contractual kind of response is really at the level of that role, and that's the only place it is. It never comes back in, nor it never comes back out. The question's never asked at that moral purpose level. Right. Now, you asked me moral purpose and moral literacy. I think the literacy occurs not only down there, so that I have to know about me, and I've got to know what teaching means to me, for me to be able to make a decision about why I want to teach at the outer level. But it's also kind of, I've got to know about me as a person, which is the next level, which is, I call that the personal level. To know both of those levels, and then to know also at the level of role, and at the level of organisation, and at the level of politic or the government, and to know at the level of culture, all of it, I have to have literacy. I have to be able to identify those processes, to see what's going on there, and to be able to make decisions about the nature of what the moral issues are involved at all levels. So I say the whole thing is about moral literacy, and that's why I think also not only is it different and complex as it goes across the whole lot of the dimensions of the taxonomy. It really it's reflected as well differently within them, because at the moral purpose level, it's a deeply owned process, whereas it can be far more imposed. I suppose the further out you go, the more they are, if you want, and that's why I call it the environment. And the environment tends to impose stuff on us, whereas the other stuff is kind of. Now, whether or not, and this is, I say, a work in progress too, Michael, whether or not there is some form of important developmental message, which I'm not too certain about yet, that if you haven't got the personal, you haven't got the moral and the personal right, then there's going to be gaps and jumps and disconnects in the literacy at the level of levels. I'm not certain of that. There is I suppose there's a feeling that I have that I would probably think that's an explanation of what sometimes happens when people, and I was giving the example of what happened on Wall Street or Enron or those kind of things, when everyone around you is cheating and there's a if you want a complete culture and ideology of people simply saying, well, it's okay. Right. I wonder what's going on elsewhere, and people confess to it because they come and say, well, would you have thought that was wrong? Absolutely. Listen to the court cases. Did you know? I mean, what would your mum think? Well, no, not. Well, why would you think it's right? Well, we all did it. Now, yeah, you might all do it, but we all pretty well kind of morally literate about the whole thing. or are you just so simply consumed by the, if you want, by the culture of Wall Street and the culture of profit, that the other stuff basically didn't matter to you anymore?
Right.
That fascinates me.
Right.
And because it suggests to me that maybe that, I don't know, it's how other people see it, but it helps me understand it, but it also raises as many questions for me.
Right. So I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of, and this is maybe not the easiest question, but given your extensive experience and expertise in educational leadership, kind of the primary qualities that you think are really central to being an educational leader, or when you're thinking about a paradigm, for an educational leader, how you conceptualize that?
It would be probably not surprising that if I was talking about an educational leader now, I would relate to the nature of the taxonomy. The most important thing about any leader who's going to lead people is that they must basically be morally literate. And I do, when I come to the level of role, I think there's lots of things we need to know. But essentially, if we don't know why we're doing it, which we come right back into the moral purpose, and we don't know basically why, in terms of nature of actually what we think is important about the nature of children and teaching, that's great. But if I don't know me too, Michael, and I don't know that I get off on a bit of power, or I'm defensive, or so that then I can be a danger to people too in the role. So I think it's essential to know the nature, not only just the values, but what goes on in the tensions between myself and role in there. I think that's incredibly important for people who want to lead. As you move out through that taxonomy, and I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm selling it, but as you move out through the taxonomy, well, then you see the essential nature. Role, you've got to know what, I've got to know what human resources are about. I've got to know what curriculum's about. I've got to know about leading curriculum because I'm a leader of learning. I'm not a bank manager, and I'm not basically a physician.
Right.
I'm a teacher, I'm a leader of learning. So essentially for my role, and I've got to understand what the moralities of good learning are. And there's my tension, of course, with No Child Left Behind.
Right.
If it hurts children, then it certainly does go to the heart of the nature of the morality of leading for learning, because learning becomes the critical issue. What is good learning? They're the critical questions for me at that level. I need to know that. I need to know what schools are like, and I need to know the nature of schooling. And even to understand those moral issues that I mentioned, of common good and the individual rights, and how we actually kind of are placed in the position of ethical discourse about that. But equally, I want our leaders to know about the nature of their place in society and what that society basically wants, because we are meeting the public responsibilities.
Right.
I might pass judgment on the stuff of literacies and numeracies as they're basically being defined at the moment now, but the people who pay have a right to actually demand. They have a right for me to be responsible to them and that I meet that need. Parents who are worried about kids' SATs have a right to actually be met. So I have that morality, that moral responsibility to them, and in the same ways, I have a responsibility also to make certain that I play a part in what I would regard to be the national or the cultural heritage, the cultural morality, and that is what do we want good kids to be in our community and in our country, and reflect what that country is about. Good leaders know all about that, and I suppose it's complex, but it's nice to be able to ask those questions about your own curriculum as you train and develop leaders, to see if you're actually addressing that throughout it. And I would also like to say why it's complex. I think the good leaders basically have those moral strengths, that they're able to identify those particular areas. There's no guarantee you get it right, but it's really important that you basically know what you're getting wrong.
Right.
You'll be able to see where the issues are, so that in some ways we can adjust, we can change, but we've got to have that literacy. We've got to be able to know what it is.
Right. Well, thank you very much. And thanks very much for taking the time to speak with me today about your research and moral literacy. It's been really instructive and helpful, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thanks.
Thank you.